and thank you all for being here this evening. I would like to thank Sigrid and Hannah for organizing this exciting Reading Scotland lecture series at Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz. I also have a personal connection to this topic since my great-grandfather was from Scotland. I look forward to sharing with you my insights on Scottish scholars and secrets, developments of dark academia in Edinburgh. Intellectuals, investigations, and insidious incidents form the heart of dark academia. This term describes both a literary subgenre and an online phenomenon, highlighting eerie aspects of erudition, which has gained widespread attention in the 21st century, especially due to online discussion and dissemination of American author Donna Tartt's 1992 novel, The Secret History. As Katja Anderson and I analyze in our article, Death, Deceit, and Detective Work in Dark Academia, books of this subgenre emphasize the equally tempting and threatening pursuit of the highest levels of knowledge and expertise, exhibiting transnational connections to such celebrated works as Goethe's Faust. This article is in a special issue of the scholarly journal Literatur in Wissenschaft und Unterricht, with other contributions by scholars such as Rainer Emich, also from the University of Mainz. The roots of dark academia can also be traced to 19th century Scottish literature. Edinburgh's elegant architecture, Gothic atmosphere, sinister spires, and narrow alleys enclosed by darkened sandstone embody for many digital content creators dark academia's essence. Dark academia both encompasses a popular contemporary trend and offers an illuminating insight into the complexities we relish in Scottish literature. My presentation explores narrative by 3 Scottish authors to illuminate how themes of dark academia address questions of identity, independence, and ethics through the spatial and social focus of Edinburgh's cityscape. First of all, inspired by historical events in the Scottish capital, Robert Louis Stevenson's short story The Body Snatcher addresses the moral implications of human dissection in Victorian medical studies. Set in Edinburgh, Muriel Sparks' The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie describes a charismatic teacher's lasting impact on 6 students, ending in a stunning betrayal. Finally, Ian Rankin's The Falls, installment 12 of the ongoing Tartan Noir series Inspector Rebus, traces the disappearance of a young university student in the Athens of the North. These 3 literary works, whose authors all studied at the University of Edinburgh, each employ their characters' exploits as a lens to magnify an exploration of Scottish society with a focus on Edinburgh's atmospheric location. Since dark academia draws upon historical events and literary traditions, Edinburgh's importance in medical innovation plays a central role. Historically, medical interest with the human body is rooted in the wish to understand anatomy and thus better heal illnesses and injuries. Medical research has long been portrayed in art, with examples dating back to the medieval wound man diagram, seen here to the left, to visualize bodily injuries. This is a digitized image that we see here made available by the Bavarian State Library. Further examples include 17th century paintings, such as the famous work The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp of the celebrated Dutch artist Rembrandt, here on the right. Medical knowledge also shaped 19th century literature, as investigated in Medicine and Mobility in 19th century British Literature, History, and Culture, a volume displayed on the right in which I published the article Embodied Interdependencies of Health and Travel in Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady and Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. As scholar Megan Coyer states, in the early 19th century, Edinburgh was the leading centre of medical education and research in Britain. The website of the Museums and Galleries Edinburgh adds that the prestige of the medical school in Edinburgh attracted students from all across Europe. Coyer further notes, the practical, relatively affordable, and non-denominational medical education available at the University of Edinburgh is considered to be a main driving force behind the professionalization of medicine in Britain. Robert Louis Stevenson, born in 1850 in Edinburgh, attained worldwide fame for his exciting stories, including Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He also explored Edinburgh's architecture, history, and cityscape in his 1878 title, Edinburgh, Picturesque Notes. His book begins with a striking description of his home. The ancient and famous metropolis of the north sits overlooking a windy estuary from the slope and summit of 3 hills. No situation could be more commanding for the head city of a kingdom, none better chosen for noble prospects. Stevenson's The Body Snatcher is a short story closely tied to Edinburgh's history, which was published in 1884 in the Pall Mall Gazette Christmas Extra. Just as Katja Anderson and I highlight in our recent article that dark academia often plays with chronology, so does Stevenson's story begin at the end in a pub in the English town of Debenham. A regular drinking quartet at the George Inn hears of the famous London physician Dr. Wolfe Macfarlane's arrival. This startles a member of their circle called Fetz, who is mainly characterized by the 5 glasses of rum he drinks every night, and who's jokingly known as the doctor for the snatches of medical knowledge he occasionally shows. When he confronts Dr. Macfarlane, recognition and terror crosses the man's face, especially once Fetz asks, "Have you seen it again?" Hereafter, the London physician fled out of the door like a detective thief. As readers uncover the terrible truth in retrospect, scholar Caroline McCracken Flesher describes this experience as, "We read backwards toward catastrophe." As dark academia integrates elements of detective fiction, Scottish literature shapes this new subgenre. David Goldie stresses the influence of Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle, with their investigative characters and suspenseful plots still marking detective fiction today, exemplified by successful tard noir titles by Ian Rankin. While both Stevenson and Doyle studied at Edinburgh, their characters, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Jekyll, live in London, akin to Dr. Macfarlane of The Body Snatcher. Readers learn that the drinker Fetz once studied medicine in Edinburgh and rose to the coveted position of subassistant to a professor to aid in the dissection lectures alongside senior assistant Macfarlane. Yet this professor is infamous in Edinburgh's past, as Stevenson implies with the following words. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of anatomy whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. Stevenson weaves references to local history into his fiction by alluding to Dr. Robert Knox, the Edinburgh physician and medical lecturer suspected of purchasing corpses from murderers William Burke and William Hare. Due to the demand for fresh corpses to dissect for medical study, resurrectionists, or body snatchers, unearthed the graves of the recently deceased, yet Burke and Hare went even further, killing 16 people to sell the bodies before being arrested in 1828. This horrific history can be studied today via Burke's skeleton on display at the Anatomy Museum of the University of Edinburgh. The unearthing of corpses for medical practitioners, as well as the notoriety of Burke and Hare, have given rise to 2 recent dark academia books, Dana Schwartz's 2022 title, Anatomy, a Love Story, set in Edinburgh, 1817, follows the meeting of a young woman wanting to become a surgeon and a young man working as a resurrectionist. A. Ray Dunlap's 2024 book, The Resurrectionist, centers on a medical student moving from Oxford to Edinburgh in 1828 before becoming entangled in the dreadful dealings of body snatchers. Moreover, the convergence of the campus novel and crime novel resonates in Scottish literature set in modern-day universities. One such example is the 2024 release To the Dogs, about a professor towing the line between academia and crime by Louisa Welsh, whose talk we had the pleasure of hearing last week in the Reading Scotland lecture series. Dark academia juxtaposes scholarly ambition with darker desires, such as in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Similarly, in Stevenson's The Body Snatcher, Fett's student days encompass a double existence of daily diligence and nightly extravagance, soon slipping into the nighttime duties of accepting corpses for the dissection lessons, implying that he comes face to face with Burke and Hare. Stevenson writes, "He would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity." The narrative discloses Edinburgh history from the perspective of an accomplice not actively involved in the infamous killings, but enmeshed in financial transactions and later participating in grave robbing. During this time, families paid for heavy mort safes, such as the one shown here in the churchyard at Collinton, to keep their deceased relatives safe from resurrectionists. As scholar Ruth Richardson notes, body snatching was an active presence during Stevenson's time, ranging from Collinton, where his grandfather served as minister, to Edinburgh, where Stevenson studied and one of his uncles learned under Dr. Knox. In the narrative, Fettes is content to go along without asking questions, until he recognizes a young woman with whom he had talked just the day before, now a cold corpse, marked with evidence of a violent death. When he informs McFarlane, the latter advises him to keep silent, and soon uses these despicable practices for his own ends. When the odious and offensive Gray, who orders audacious amounts of food while McFarlane settles the bill, jokes about McFarlane's incensed expression, Fettes jests that medical students have a singular way of dealing with annoyances. When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him. This joke soon becomes deadly earnest when McFarlane arrives at night with a new body for the dissection room, none other than Gray. Scholar McCracken Flesher observes that the victim's name invokes the Grays living in 19th century Edinburgh, guests of infamous William Burke, who discovered one of the murderer's victims and subsequently contacted the police. In Stevenson's story, McFarlane pressures Fettes to let the evidence of the grisly crime disappear as the study object for students the next day. One rainy night, McFarlane and Fettes go grave robbing and steal the body of an old woman from a nearby town. Yet their midnight endeavor takes an uncanny turn when returning to Edinburgh. The sack in which they transport the woman's corpse seems to hold a different load. They open the sack to find Gray within, once again whole, despite the dissection. Readers are immersed in visceral descriptions of the two drenched students' mortal terror upon seeing the transfigured corpse on their cart. This foregrounds the body's actions and sensory perception, key components in narratives of the 19th century, as I analyze in my dissertation, The Reader, the Body, and the Book, published in 2025 by J.B. Metzler with Springer. In my dissertation, I analyze works by Anne and Charlotte Bronte, Henry James, and Thomas Hardy. In The Body Snatcher, Fetz and Macfarlane are frozen in terror on that fateful night, later parting ways up until their reunion, years later, far from Edinburgh. This reflects scholar Penny Fielding's analysis that Stevenson's publications are, and I quote, inflected with the global consciousness of modernity, further exemplified by a passage in Edinburgh Picturesque Notes, which alludes to emigrants from the Athens of the North spread across the world from North America to New Zealand, as the author imagines a diasporic Scotland. In this vein, we can triangulate commonalities connecting authors Stevenson, Spark, and Rankin. Due to his respiratory illness and tuberculosis, Stevenson sought out the French Riviera, Switzerland, Bournemouth in Britain, California and New York in the United States, Tahiti, Sydney in Australia, as well as American Samoa. Just as Spark lived in Edinburgh, Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe, London, New York, Rome, and Tuscany throughout her life, Rankin moved to London, France, and the US before returning to Edinburgh. All three authors have a history of mobility as they collected experiences all across the globe that shaped their literature. On that note, let us turn to Muriel Spark, born in Edinburgh just like Stevenson, and known for her works such as Memento Mori and The Driver's Seat. Ian Rankin, who conducted doctoral research on Muriel Spark, called her the greatest Scottish novelist of modern time, following her death in 2006. One of her most famous publications is The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, with its inception detailed by the National Library of Scotland, and I quote, "In December 1960, Muriel Spark returned to her parents' home in Edinburgh. From a 4-week outpouring of creativity, she completed one of the greatest novels of the 20th century." This story centers on the exploits of the titular teacher and her students. Scholar Kayue He characterizes the memorable Miss Brodie as a dramatic and seductive performer and director of a small, select coterie of pupils, rather than a responsible teacher. For instance, Miss Brodie gives a lesson on the art of deception as she instructs her students to hold up their history books in case any visitor should drop by, while she revels in her retelling of her romantic visits to Italy. This advice later becomes her own downfall at the hands of a girl from her select group of students, whom she singles out to instruct and mold after her own ideals. As the teacher announces, "Give me a girl at an impressionable age, and she is mine for life." This so-called Brodie set is composed of 6 girls: Monica Douglas with math skills and an explosive temper, Eunice Gardner with a talent for gymnastics, graceful Jenny Gray, perpetually bullied Mary McGregor, tomboyish Rose Stanningley, and Sandy Stranger, who's close friends with Jenny but keeps her true thoughts often to herself. The formulaic way the girls are referenced in the story makes their identities appear predetermined. One such example is Rose, who is designated as being, and I quote, famous for sex, 4 times throughout the narrative, until it resembles an epithet as a descriptive addition to her name. Likewise, early on in the story, Mary's final fate is unceremoniously revealed. Mary McGregor, lumpy with merely 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, like a snowman, who was later famous for being stupid and always to blame, and who, at the age of 23, lost her life in a hotel fire. Her future seems an inescapable outcome, a key component of dark academia. Michael Gardner and Willie Maley note that Spark gained global renown for her literature, which excels at capturing the major cultural concerns of her time in a deceptively simple style, or a deceptively spare style. The scholars add that even her widely popular The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, marked by humor and focusing on a school setting, investigates crucial themes including education, enlightenment, and progress. Here we see Maggie Smith playing Miss Brodie in the 1969 film, adapted by J. Preston Allen. In response to a message from Muriel Spark, complimenting Maggie Smith for her Oscar nomination, the actress replied with a telegram on 8 April 1970 to thank the author, and I quote, "for creating such a wonderful character for me to play, as can be seen here in an exhibit from the National Library of Scotland." A 2024 online blog dedicated to dark academia lists The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie as a key example of this subgenre, and encourages readers to visit Edinburgh to take in the city's intellectual atmosphere. The blog lists as atmospheric locations the Grassmarket, a historic marketplace in Edinburgh with medieval roots and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1995, as well as Harriet's School, said to have inspired the fictional Marcia Blaine School for Girls in Spark's narrative. In a 1991 article in The New Yorker on the inspirations for The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, Muriel Spark, née Comeback, mentions Harriet School as one of several prominent schools in Edinburgh, alongside James Gillespie's High School for Girls, where Spark herself received her education. The author elucidates on her school experiences and one teacher in particular. "I fell into Miss K's hands at the age of 11. It might well be said that she fell into my hands. Little did she know, little did I know, that she bore within her the seeds of the future Miss Jean Brodie." She further says, "I had always enjoyed watching teachers. We had a large class of about 40 girls. A classroom that size, with a sole performer on stage before an audience sitting in rows, looking and listening, is essentially theater." This jives with her representation of Miss Brodie's theatrical performance while teaching, occasionally interspaced with the mundane, as the following scene shows. Miss Brodie stood in her brown dress like a gladiator, with raised arm and eyes flashing like a sword. "Hail Caesar!" she cried again, turning radiantly to the window light, as if Caesar sat there. "Who opened the window?" said Miss Brodie, dropping her arm. Her grand speech is humorously interrupted, yet also authoritarian, as she declares a window opened more than 6 inches to be vulgar. Miss Brodie's report of her holiday travels in Italy, via her personal photos, mixes her highly subjective views of art history, contemporary politics, religion, and her own clothing choices. She says, "Here is a Cimabue. Here is a larger formation of Mussolini's fascisti. It is a better view of them than that of last year's pictures. They are doing splendid things, as I shall tell you later. I went with my friends for an audience with the Pope. My friends kissed his ring, but I thought it proper only to bend over it. I wore a long black gown with a lace mantilla and looked magnificent." Her dual focus on fascism and fashion reveals a dangerously surface-level idealization of flashy appearances. While detailing her success in replacing 2 spinster sisters as the caretaker of the music teacher, Miss Brodie likens her domestic power play to an infamous individual from Edinburgh's history. Proudly she announces, "I am a descendant, do not forget, of Willie Brodie, a man of substance." In 18th-century Edinburgh, Deacon William Brodie's respectable existence as a locksmith, cabinet maker, and member of the city council by day contrasted with his robberies by night, for which he was ultimately arrested and executed. Miss Brodie informs her students with the words, "Eventually he was a wanted man for having robbed the excise office. Not that he needed the money. He was a night burglar only for the sake of the danger in it. Of course, he was arrested abroad and was brought back to the Tolbooth prison, but that was mere chance. He died cheerfully on a gibbet of his own devising in 1788. However all this may be, it is the stuff I am made of. Spark lets her character foreground grim local history in a cheerful manner, her satisfaction in misconduct and mendacity fitting to dark academia. Moreover, Stevenson owed furniture made by Deacon Brodie, whose twofold lifestyle inspired the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The prime of Miss Jean Brodie also resonates with dark academia via scholarly content and a focus on characters' intellect and imagination. On the one hand, dark academia uses scholarly references to underpin emotionally resonant moments in the narrative, such as foreshadowing through parallels between characters and historical personalities. One example is the Brodie set's trust in their teacher's resistance against attempts to force her to resign. The narrator declares, "As soon expect Julius Caesar to apply for a job at a crank school as Miss Brodie. She would never resign. If the authorities wanted to get rid of her, she would have to be assassinated." On the other hand, the student's imagination is essential to the story. There is a divide between Sandy's outward actions and her thoughts, which becomes clear with these words. Sandy was never bored, but in order never to be bored, she had to lead a double life of her own. Sandy envisions elaborate conversations with literary characters, such as the Lady of Shalott from Alfred Tennyson's poem, or Mr. Rochester of Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. Just as Sandy additionally composes stories on the imaginary romantic exploits of her teacher, so does Muriel Spark delineate how her early poems published in the school paper were often inspired by her teacher, Miss Kay. Scholar Randall Stevenson asserts that Spark's novel shows Jean Brodie and Sandy Stranger engaged in what he calls a struggle to see who can shape reality most adroitly around her visions and versions of it. A crucial scene is Miss Brodie's stroll through Old Town Edinburgh to bring the girls into contact with other social classes. However, a sense of distance rather than connection overshadows the outing, as the students are frightened by the poverty and harsh language they witness. The narrator describes, "The Canongate, the Grass Market, the Lawn Market were names that betokened a misty region of crime and desperation." Since 1995, these locations are part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Edinburgh's New and Old Towns. In the story, Sandy, who until now only saw these streets from within her uncle's car, gains with this walk her first experience of a foreign country, a city divided not only along roads and elevation, but also among financial and social fault lines. Scholar Kayue He contends that Miss Brodie uses this pedestrian excursion through the cold to shape her group's cohesion, to strengthen their sense of insularity, and thus Brodie tightens her rule over the group. This division also snakes its way through the group of girls, for while Miss Brodie instructs her students, Sandy deliberately ignores Mary McGregor, the scapegoat of their cluster. Sandy rather loses herself in an imagined conversation with Alan Breck Stewart. Alan Breck was a historical figure who fought in the Jacobite army and gained fame through the association of his name with the Appin murder in 1752, as well as his central role in Stevenson's novel Kidnapped and the sequel Katrina. The statue to the right shows Stevenson's main characters, Highlander Alan Breck Stewart and Lowlander David Balfour, standing proudly in Edinburgh. Inspired by her recent perusal of Stevenson's novel, Sandy's daydreaming showcases narrative creativity in response to reading, as she mentally writes herself into the tale as a brave heroine, risking her life to deliver a message across the moors. This imagined exchange with Alan Breck threads through the dialogue, drowning out Miss Brodie's description of the city's history, and acting as a mental buffer for Sandy when she pointedly ignores Mary. The group's walk parallels teaching, with Miss Brodie defining this word etymologically with the following lines. The word education comes from the root ig, from ex, out, and duco, I lead, meaning a leading out. To me, education is a leading out of what is already there in the pupil's soul. However, her way of walking and instructing her students gives her interpretation of leading an additional authoritarian meaning. Miss Brodie, who idealizes Mussolini's fascisti, also echoes with the root duco the Italian leader's title Il Duce, and thus provides a negative connotation to readers today. Sandy experiences a moment of acute awareness upon realizing that Miss Brodie gathers the girls around her like obedient troops. Even though Sandy briefly feels the urge to be nicer to Mary, fear of stepping outside the assigned roles leads her to insult her classmate instead. She sees the Brodie set, and I quote, all in a frightening little moment, in unified compliance to the destiny of Miss Brodie, as if God had willed them to birth for that purpose. She was even more frightened then by her temptation to be nice to Mary McGregor, since by this action she would separate herself and be lonely and blamable. This reveals a poisoned atmosphere as Miss Brodie, according to scholar Hosmer, manipulates her students, creating a vicarious life for herself. She plans out who will become successful, pushing one of her students to spend time with the school's married art teacher in hopes of a love affair. The narrator reports, "It was plain that Miss Brodie wanted Rose, with her instinct, to start preparing to be Teddy Lloyd's lover, and Sandy, with her insight, to act as informant on the affair. This game of assigning destinies to the girls, pushing them into place like chess pieces, fits to the moral decay and devious machinations in dark academia fiction. As the narrative spans several years, 18-year-old Sandy pushes against this by starting an affair with the art teacher, thereby not truly escaping Miss Brodie's plans, but rather reassigning the roles to spite Miss Brodie's scheming. She delights in misleading Miss Brodie, seeing her in a favorable light when the woman is duped." Sandy's thoughts are revealed in the following passage. "It was then that Miss Brodie looked beautiful and fragile, just as dark, heavy Edinburgh itself could suddenly be changed into a floating city when the light was a special pearly white, and fell upon one of the gracefully fashioned streets." This simile emphasizes that people not only reside in, but also reflect cities in their appearance and atmosphere. In the end, Sandy reports her teacher's political leanings for a totalitarian system to the headmistress of the school, forcing Miss Brodie to resign, thus executing her in a career assassination. Yet Sandy's final line about how Miss Brodie in her prime was decisive in her own decision to become a Catholic nun is ambiguous. Is it an expression of triumph after Sandy beat a manipulator at her own game? An admission that Miss Brodie's influence is inescapable? Or rather a realization that student and teacher have more in common after all? Let us now turn to contemporary Scottish crime fiction for a final exploration of Edinburgh's literary fame. Ian Rankin's successful Inspector Rebus book series is named after the police officer D.I. John Rebus, whose murder investigations began in 1987, with the most recent book, Midnight in Blue, published in 2024. From the first book, Noughts and Crosses onward, Rankin overtly incorporates references to Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, especially in his first two titles, centered around his detective. In an article in The Guardian, Rankin traces his literary career to his own time in academia. He wrote, "As a student in Edinburgh, my interest in Stevenson took me to Jekyll and Hyde, and from there to a central question. What makes us do bad things to one another, century after century? Crime fiction seemed the best means to attempt an answer." For instance, in Noughts and Crosses, Rebus reviews old case files in hopes of uncovering a clue to solve a series of murders, and thereby experiences an uncanny sensation of glimpsing a darker, dangerous side of himself reflected in the files. The narrator reports, "Rebus felt his mouth filling with silt. It was as if he saw himself there, time after time after time, the self that lurked behind his everyday consciousness. His Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, Edinburgh born." The Scottish capital city plays a central role in the Inspector Rebus series, visualized by the interactive map on the author's website, locating important places from the books in Edinburgh. Scholar Ian R. Cook underlines the connections between fact and fiction in the book's plots, since Rebus resides on the same street, Arden Street, that Rankin inhabited as a student. The thrilling conclusion of Noughts and Crosses, the first book in the series, drives home the cityscape's spatial significance in Rankin's novels. A friend from Rebus's time in the military feels abandoned by the protagonist, and thus seeks revenge through the murders of several young women in Edinburgh, culminating in the kidnapping of Rebus's daughter. Aspects of dark academia surface through scenes in a local library, where the murderer hides in plain sight by acting as an amiable librarian in the children's section while scouting for his next victim. The ultimate confrontation leads to the detective chasing the murderer through a network of adjoining tunnels. This subterranean finale recalls Stevenson's Edinburgh picturesque notes, illustrating the architecture, climate, and history of the metropolis. In the third chapter on the Parliament Close, Stevenson delineates a local legend about a Highland piper who attempted to walk an underground route connecting the castle and Holyrood while playing his pipes to map the tunnels. A crowd accompanying his trek through the streets above ground followed the sound of his music, until it suddenly stopped around the church of St. Giles. As the author concludes, whether he was choked with gases, or perished in a clog, or was removed bodily by the evil one, remains a point of doubt. But the piper has never again been seen or heard of from that day to this. Edinburgh is famous for its ghost stories, ranging all the way from Stevenson to Rankin. Scholar Sylvia Magnetal highlights that the Inspector Rebus series presents a high degree of both spatial and temporal real-world referentiality, with the investigators in the 12th part of the Inspector Rebus series, The Falls, visiting the History of Surgery Museum, the National Museum of Scotland, and the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. Magnetal notes that these three sites are dedicated to the gathering and dissemination of knowledge. I argue that these places dedicated to the learnings of anatomy and botany reinforce aspects of dark academia. The book The Falls highlights connections between police and academic research via a triangle of investigation, with three characters exploring mysteries of the present, the recent past, and the distant past, respectively. First, we have DC Siobhan Clarke partaking in an online challenge to solve riddles sent by a killer. These riddles mix role-playing via modern technology with wordplay and obscure facts about local history. The author explains that he added Siobhan later in the series as a balance to his protagonist and writes, I had found Rebus's perfect working partner, someone who respected him but could still be infuriated by his reluctance to stick to the rules. Someone confident enough in their own abilities to be able to give as good as they got. British Siobhan with a university degree differs from Rebus's Scottish working-class background, thereby emulating a key pattern in dark academia fiction, which Katja Anderson and I define as intertwined oppositions create fault lines of friction between protagonists, to provide an inside and outside view of education and investigation. As the second point of this triangle of characters in the novel The Falls, Rebus dives into the recent past, visiting the township Falls in East Lothian near Edinburgh, where the murder victim of the main case grew up. It is a former mining town suffering unemployment ever since the coal mines closed 40 years ago, thereby reflecting the author Rankin's childhood experiences in Cardendon, Fife, in Scotland. While working on this case, Rebus comes across clues indicating a wider web of violence at play, as he finds connections between several mysterious deaths over the past decades. The last member of this trio is museum curator Jean Burchell, who becomes fascinated by Dr. Katja Anderson Lovell, a fictitious Edinburgh physician of the 19th century, whom Rankin invents as an assistant to the autopsy of Burke to deepen the dark shadow of the past infringing upon the present. Jean Burchell's research unearths strange connections to the current case that unsettle her, and I quote, history only brought her in contact with the long dead, and then usually as mere references in books or artifacts discovered through digs. The author establishes a clear contrast between Burchell's exploration of deceased individuals of bygone eras, Rebus's investigation of recent deaths, and Professor Donald Devlin's interactions with fresh cadavers as a former police pathologist aiding the investigation. Each of these characters, museum curator, police investigator, and former police pathologist, sees the city through the lens of their own expertise, as demonstrated by Professor Devlin's comment, "The history of surgery is the history of Edinburgh." Just as scholar Caroline McCracken-Flesher notes that in a prior book of the series titled Set in Darkness, detective work is compared to archaeologists' endeavors as both unearth enlightening clues. So does The Falls also underscore parallels between Rebus and the museum curator. The repeated shifts back to the museum throughout The Falls underpins the spatio-temporal sphere of scholarly settings that feature prominently in dark academia. With Jean Burchell sharing the first name of the titular character in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, indirectly alluded to during a scene in the book with a woman reading a title by Muriel Spark, the museum curator mirrors the police in her dedicated examination of the city's past. The literary references do not stop there. The murder victim is a student called Philippa Balfour, whose name echoes David Balfour, protagonist of Stevenson's Kidnapped. Moreover, there are a multiplicity of falls in the aptly named novel, ranging from waterfalls in the old mining town to a character's death by falling after a heart attack, as well as links to French author Albert Camus' La Chute and the fall of man linked to British poet John Milton's Paradise Lost. Rebus seeks out Jean's expertise due to a small hand-carved wooden coffin found in the town Falls. Jean informs him about the true history surrounding several such small coffins from the 19th century. In 1836, a few boys discovered 17 fairy coffins on the elevation of Arthur's Seat overlooking Edinburgh, of which 8 are preserved today in the National Museum of Scotland. The fascination surrounding this mysterious find lives on, as in 2014, a replica coffin with an attached note featuring the final lines of Stevenson's The Body Snatcher was sent to the museum, 130 years after Stevenson's story. Visiting the museum inspired Ian Rankin. As he states, I was intrigued by these little dolls, which is how I made the acquaintance of the Arthur's Seat coffins. As soon as I saw them, I knew they would make a great story, especially as no one had come up with an incontrovertible interpretation of their meaning. In the Falls, Jean explains, the coffins interest me because they are such a mystery. Rebus begins digging into how the coffins may be linked to a series of mysterious deaths that were previously attributed to suicides or unsolved disappearances, but in retrospect reveal a damning pattern. Meanwhile, Jean's research about Dr. Lovell takes on a grisly, visceral hue. The gory description of the autopsy of the executed murderer Burke is laid out in morbid detail in Rankin's novel. According to one report of the time, the quantity of blood that gushed out was enormous, and by the time the lecture was finished, the area of the classroom had the appearance of a butcher's slaughterhouse, from its flowing down and being trodden upon. Her research begins to infiltrate her dreams. When Jean seeks out Professor Devlin as an expert on Dr. Lovell, his comment, "Who better than an anatomist to get away with murder?" foreshadows his own role in a series of unsolved murders documented by the small coffins. Although the past shapes the present, it can remain hidden in plain sight. The murderer of the young student Philippa Balfour is her boyfriend, right under the nose of the investigators and the readers. He's introduced in the very first chapter, fading out of focus as the story unfolds, only to reappear as the mysterious organizer of the online game Siobhan found. Moreover, Professor Devlin uses the past as a smokescreen by pointing to Dr. Lovell in order to distract from his own series of killings. Yet this ploy ends up leading Jean Burchill directly to him. With the reveal of Professor Devlin's devilish acts, Rankin transforms a mild-mannered academic into a monster, and turns an unsolved museum mystery into a life-or-death threat, as curator Jean finds herself face-to-face with the murderer, only barely surviving the encounter once Rebus arrives and the professor is arrested. These 3 narratives are not the only examples of dark academia fiction focusing on Scotland. The 2021 novel Madam by British-French author Phoebe Wynne centers on a young teacher of classical literature traveling to a remote boarding school on the Scottish coast, filled with an oppressive atmosphere and strangely sinister traditions. Similarly, Joanna Margaret's 2022 book, The Bequest, follows a PhD student moving from Boston to Scotland, only to learn that her advisor has recently died, and then embarking upon a hunt for clues when a close friend mysteriously disappears. Finally, C.F. Barrington's recently released title, When We Were Killers, from 2025, is set at St. Andrews University in Scotland, where friendship among students turns dangerous as they dive into Scottish history and nighttime rituals. The 3 narratives by Stevenson, Spark, and Rankin we covered here today all explore the intertwinement of past and present in Edinburgh as a capital concealing crimes, a city filled with suspicion, as well as a metropolis of medical innovation and artistic inspiration. Evoking the key facets of dark academia fiction, this trio of books shows Edinburgh as a mosaic of puzzle pieces through which protagonists navigate, just as the stories encompass a kaleidoscope of inverted or interrupted chronology via switching perspectives and multiple moments in time. Delving into the hauntings of history not only generates exciting, atmospheric tales, but also accentuates questions of morality, as well as quests for truth and justice in the face of coercion and crimes. All three narratives foreground the tension between independence and dependence amid characters' interactions with deceit. While the students, Fetz and McFarlane, are tied together by their dark secret, Sandy and Miss Brodie are locked in a silent battle for control over one another. And finally, the investigations, in hopes of identifying a murderer, lead Siobhan, Rebus, and Jean into different directions and into danger. Readers thus share characters' ambitions and mistakes in visceral vibrance, as I explore in more detail in my analysis of sensory-motor experiences in my dissertation, The Reader, the Body, and the Book. This rich, multifaceted past in the Athens of the North, just waiting to be discovered, makes Edinburgh a locus of literary creativity, inspiring authors and enchanting readers from the 19th century to today. Thank you for your attention. Here we have my works cited. Thank you very much.